Hello. For this section, we would like to cover section 4, which has to do with transporting passengers safely. This is the section that you'll need to know in order to take and pass your test at the DMV to get your passenger endorsement. And when taking this test, we want to think like public transportation drivers, specifically those drivers driving CTA or PACE buses that you see in the Chicago area. And so it's those type of vehicles that we are thinking about as we dive into this content. So first, let me draw your attention to the first line that says bus drivers must have a commercial driver's license if they drive a vehicle designed to seat 16 or more persons, including the driver. So make note specifically in this section that this endorsement is required for driving 16 or more people. 4.1 talks about vehicle inspection, which we've learned about in other sections, but just make note that before driving our bus, we must make sure it's safe. And so we must review the inspection report made by the previous driver. And that this report often includes making sure we know and report any defects that have been noted. If they've been noted previously, we make sure that they've been repaired, and we note any defects when we submit our vehicle inspection report. Make note of the things that you will be checking, and specifically the vehicle systems. So 4.1.1 covers those. Specifically, let me draw your attention to the bullet point that says tires. Front wheels must not have recapped or regrooved tires. So this is repeat from section 2, and it's also mentioned in section 10 with school bus that the front tires of our commercial motor vehicles, in this case specifically our buses, cannot have recapped, regrooved, or retreaded tires on the front wheels. Also make note of the last bullet point that says emergency equipment. So this is another reminder of the emergency equipment that you should have on your bus, specifically a fire extinguisher, emergency reflectors, and spare electrical fuses if the bus has that type of system. Next, go down to the bus interior, 4.1.3. Make note of each of these bullet points, specifically the parts that must be in safe and working order as shared here. Each handhold and railing, floor covering, signaling devices, including the restroom emergency buzzer if the bus has a restroom, and emergency exit handles. Make note of this line here that says the seats must be safe for riders and all seats must be securely fastened to the bus. And so it's important to note that buses must be securely fastened. You cannot have folding chairs in a bus. So if you see a question that asks you how many seats can you have that are not fastened to the bus, the answer is 0. The next line says never drive with an open emergency exit or window, and that the emergency exit sign on an emergency door must be clearly visible. And so this is a note that specifically in passenger vehicles like CTA and PACE, that there are emergency exit signs. We don't necessarily have these in trucks, semis, or in school buses, but we have them specifically emergency exit signs on these types of CTA or PACE transit buses. So we want to make sure that those are clearly visible, and if they are illuminated, that light is on. You'll also see in the sentence says never drive with an open emergency exit door or window. So we check to make sure those are closed, and we make sure that our emergency exit doors are securely latched, but never locked, because people need to be able to escape in case of an emergency. Let's take a look on page 69. We take a look at roof hatches. So this is just so that you note that there are roof hatches on many of our buses. It says you may lock some emergency roof hatches in a partly open position for fresh air, but do not leave them open as a regular practice. Keep in mind the bus's higher clearance when driving with them open. And so you'll see in buses in the ceiling, these square roof hatches that can be angled up or popped up for ventilation, and they should be closed specifically in inclement weather like rain or snow. But you can use these to help ensure good ventilation and fresh air is brought into the bus. 4.1.5 reminds us to use our seatbelt. Says the driver's seat should have a seatbelt and always use it for safety. And we learned in the school bus section that we should have our seatbelt on anytime the bus is in motion. Then let's take a look at 4.2.1 hazardous materials. We looked specifically at the types of signage that's required when transporting hazardous materials, but it's important to note that there's some hazardous materials that can and cannot be carried on a bus. So let's make note of the first sentence that says, watch for cargo or baggage containing hazardous materials. It says most hazardous materials cannot be carried on a bus. However, the federal hazardous materials table shows us which materials are hazardous and explains specifically the types of materials we can carry. But it says, do not transport any hazardous materials unless you are sure the rules allow it. And so 4.2.2 then talks about some of the forbidden hazardous materials. It says that buses may carry small arms ammunition labeled OARM-ORM-D. And this is essentially ordnance that is being disposed of. You can also carry emergency hospital supplies and drugs, and you can carry small amounts of some other hazardous materials if the shipper cannot ship them any other way. But buses may must never carry the following bullet points. So Division 2.3 poison gas, tear gas, any irritating material that may be in gas form, no more than 100 pounds of solid class 6 poisons, explosives in the space occupied by people except small arms ammunition, items labeled radioactive, and then more than 500 pounds total of allowed hazardous material and no more than 100 pounds of any one class. Make note specifically of those numbers, as you might see that as a question on the test. Specifically, you may be asked, what can you carry? So you may carry small arms ammunition labeled ORM-D, emergency hospital supplies and drugs, and small amounts of other materials, but no more than 500 pounds total and no more than 100 pounds of any one class. Make note of those numbers. You don't necessarily need to know more than that. That's essentially the basics of what we need to know when driving a bus. The next line says, riders sometimes board a bus with an unlabeled hazardous material. Do not allow riders to carry on common hazards such as car batteries or gasoline. And so make note that if a passenger gets on your bus with a can of gasoline because their car stalled out, that they are not allowed to be on that bus. 4.2.3 talks about the standee line. This is going to be a line on your bus that essentially says people cannot stand in front of this line. So it says no rider may stand forward of the rear of the driver's seat. So that's where you'll usually see this line, the standee line. It says buses are designed to allow standing buses that are designed to allow standing must have a 2-inch line on the floor or some other means of showing riders where they cannot stand. And so we often refer to this as the standee line. So all standing riders must stand behind it. And that is usually at least behind the driver's seat, the rear of the driver's seat, if not farther back. Make note of the next section, 4.2.4, at your destination. So when arriving at your destination, you as the driver should announce these specific 4 things. Make note of this, as you might see this on the test. So you should announce the location, the reason for stopping, the next departure time, and the bus number. So again, we're thinking like CTA and PACE, driving down the road, you're making multiple stops, and when you stop and pull over, you're making that announcement. Now, some buses, if you've been on CTA or PACE, you know, they have a recording of someone actually telling you the stop that you are at. But if you don't have that, make sure you as the driver are announcing these 4 things. You also want to remind riders to take any carry-ons with them if they get off the bus. And if the aisle is on a lower level than the seats, remind them to step down. And it's best to tell them these things before you come to a complete stop. The next line says charter bus drivers should not allow riders on the bus until departure time. So it's important to know that anytime that someone is on your bus, they are your responsibility. And so if they are on your bus and they cause damage or they get injured, that is your responsibility. And so by ensuring that people are not on the bus until it is time for departure helps prevent theft, vandalism, or any injury. So let's flip over to page 70 and let's talk about what you do when you're on the road. Specifically, let me make note of a few things. The first being 4.3.2 at stops. Specifically, let me direct your attention to this paragraph that says, occasionally, you may have a drunk or disruptive rider. You must ensure this rider's safety as well as that of others. Do not discharge such riders or do not put these riders off the bus in a spot where it will be unsafe for them. It may be safer at the next scheduled stop or a well-lighted area where there are other people. And it says many carriers have guidelines for handling disruptive riders. So it's important to note that even if they are drunk and disorderly or disruptive, that you are still responsible for their safety and ensuring they get off at a safe spot. Now let's go down to 4.3.5, specifically railroad highway crossing stops. We cover this in just about every section, specifically stopping at highway crossings. We learned that for semis or trucks hauling cargo, that you don't necessarily have to stop at railroad crossings unless the cargo is mandated by law to do so. For school buses, we always stop at railroad highway crossings. And for passenger buses like CTA and PACE, we do the same. So we stop our bus between 15 and 50 feet before railroad crossings. It's important to make note that we are listening and looking in both directions for trains, and we should open our forward door, or what we would call the service door, to help improve our ability to see an approaching train. So before crossing, after a train has passed, you make sure another train isn't coming down the tracks. If your bus has a manual transmission, we never change gears while crossing tracks. And that's actually true for automatic transmissions as well. If you're in an automatic bus or bus that has automatic transmission, you'll want to shift to low before crossing the tracks and shift back into drive after the tracks. If it's a manual transmission, shift down to the first gear before crossing. You then cross the tracks and then shift up. But we never change gears while crossing tracks. So make note of that, as you might see a question on the test that asks you some question related to that. You do not have to stop in the following when the following conditions are there. So it says at streetcar crossings where policemen or flagmen are directing traffic, if the traffic signal is green, and at crossings marked exempt or abandoned. Now it's important to note this is directly related to driving a bus. And so make note of those exceptions to stopping. In these cases, you would slow down and carefully check for other vehicles, but you wouldn't necessarily stop. 4.3.6 talks about drawbridges. And so we also have a specific distance that we need to make sure to stop for drawbridges. It says stop at drawbridges. So you stop at drawbridges that do not have a signal light or traffic control attendant. And you stop at least 50 feet before the drawbridge. So make note of that spacing. So we stop between 15 and 50 feet for railroad crossings, but we stop at least 50 feet before a drawbridge that does not have a signal light or traffic control attendant. Make note that you do not need to stop, but must slow down if and make sure that it's safe when there is a traffic light showing green. The bridge attendant has, or traffic officer who controls traffic, whenever the bridge opens. So if there is an attendant or officer there, you can then slow down if they are directing you to do so. So then we go over to page 71, and just a few things to make note of is 4.5, specifically prohibited practices. So it says these are prohibited practices, and let me direct your attention to a few bullet points. The first is that you should avoid fueling your bus with riders on board unless absolutely necessary. You never refuel in a closed building with riders on board. You need to make sure you have adequate ventilation, and we often are just transporting passengers and should not have them on board when needing to fuel. The next is to not talk to riders or engage in other distracting activity while driving. Now, it's good to be friendly, but it's important to note that your primary responsibility is to ensure their safety while driving. Then finally, we do not tow or push a disabled bus with riders aboard the vehicle unless getting off the bus would be unsafe. And we only tow or push the bus to the nearest safe spot to discharge passengers in that case. So make note that we do not typically tow or push a bus with riders aboard. And then finally, 4.6 talks about the brake door interlocks. So specifically make note of this, as this is something that is unique to mass transit vehicles like CTA and PACE. It's not necessarily relevant for school buses, not necessarily relevant for trucks or semis. So here you see that it says urban mass transit coaches may have a brake and accelerator interlock system. The interlock applies the brakes and holds the throttle in the idle position when the rear door is open. The interlock releases when you close the rear door. It says do not use the safety feature in place of the parking brake. So let me explain this, because you will most likely see a question on the test that asks you about these brake door interlocks. So when you take a look at a CTA or PACE bus, you'll see that there's a front service door and a rear service door. And with these buses that have two doors that you can enter or exit out of, again, this isn't the rear emergency door, but this is a door that is intended to be used regularly for passengers to load and unload. When the rear door is open, the bus is set up so that the brakes are applied and the throttle is in idle or like neutral. And so this ensures that when that rear door is open, that the bus is not going to move, so that you ensure people are completely on or completely off the bus before the bus is in motion. And so this interlock, it says it releases when you close the rear door. We still go through the process of applying the parking brake when making stops. And so this doesn't replace that process, but it is in addition to that, an additional way to ensure that people aren't falling out the back door and risk falling under the bus or risk getting injured in some other way by falling out of the bus. So those are the brake door interlocks. And that concludes section 4. Now, section 4 is a short section specifically related to transporting passengers. Make sure that you take a practice test so that you are able to refresh and get and understand these concepts effectively. It's important to note that for this test, the DMV may also pull in questions from section 1, section 2, or section 3. So make sure you're also familiar with that content, but this content in section 4 is specifically about transporting passengers. With that, that concludes this section and this review video.